Okay, so the next big event, certainly that Plutarch tells us all about, is the Third Servile War, which is the Spartacan Revolt, which is very famous, isn't it? There's a TV series that came out not too long ago, which I actually haven't seen. Probably should watch it, but I just haven't seen it. Then there's the famous old 60s film with Kirk Douglas and Tony Curtis. I've seen that a number of times. But the real history of the Spartacan Revolt, or the Third Servile War, is a fantastic story. It's filled with adventure, and Crassus is inexplicably bound up with it. So let's talk about that for a moment. As the name suggests, the Third Servile War, there had been two previous sort of big, giant, really, slave uprisings, to the point where they crossed some sort of threshold where you could describe them as a war. The other two, though, were in Sicily, so never really cut to the heart of Rome, whereas Spartacus was in mainland Italy, not even a fantastic distance from Rome in the first instance. And remember that Roman society was very heavily reliant upon slaves. The ratio of free people to slaves was crazy. There was lots and lots of slaves. Like in a prison, the number of guards to inmates is an important ratio, and you know, if the inmates realise their own numbers and their own strength, and if they have the will to rise up against the wardens and the guards, they can nearly always do so. Well, it's the same in ancient Rome. In America in the 19th century, for example, there were very few slave uprisings, very, very few, and even the ones that there were, and there were some, they were small in number. In the United States in the 19th century, a slave uprising of 80 or 90 slaves was a big one. And you're not going to get very far with 80 or 90 slaves. 80 or 90 slaves that have deliberately been kept from being able to read or write or ride a horse. They're not going to be able to sort of raise an army and fight back properly. Whereas in 1st century BC Rome, that's not the case. They are going to be able to do such things. So let me read this important passage from Plutarch, who says this, quote, "The rising of the gladiators and their devastation of Italy, which is generally known as the War of Spartacus, began as follows. A man called Lentulus Batiatus had an establishment of gladiators at Capua." Again, Capua, not that far from Rome in the scheme of things. "Most of them were Gauls and Thracians. They had done nothing wrong, but simply because of the cruelty of their owner, were kept in close confinement until the time came for them to engage in combat. 200 of them planned to escape, but their plan was betrayed, and only 78, who realised this, managed to act in time and get away, armed with choppers and spits, which they seized from some cookhouse. On the road, they came across some wagons, which were carrying arms for gladiators to another city, and they took these arms for their own use. They then occupied a strong position and elected 3 leaders. The first of these was Spartacus. He was a Thracian from the nomadic tribes, and not only had a great spirit and great physical strength, but was, much more than one could expect from his condition, most intelligent and cultured, being more like a Greek than a Thracian. They say that when he was first taken to Rome to be sold, a snake was seen coiled around his head while he was asleep, and his wife, who came from the same tribe and was a prophetess subject to possession by the frenzy of Dionysus, declared that this sign meant that he would have a great and terrible power which would end in misfortune. This woman shared in his escape and was then living with him." End quote. So first of all, when the Roman state realised that there was a big slave revolt happening in and around the Capua region, they sent 3,000 soldiers, in the first case under somebody called Clodius, to just put it down, expecting that would be, you know, probably more than enough. But as we were just told there, Spartacus was clever. He was wily. He was absolutely no fool. And he managed to sort of outwit them. He sort of climbed up some cliffs, and then whilst the Roman soldiers thought they were still up there, they scaled down the backside of these cliffs, sort of circled round this contingent of 3,000 legionaries and cut into them from behind and chopped them up and beat them. Now, no one was really expecting that to happen. If there is ever a slave revolt, the runaway slaves might cause a swathe of havoc amongst sort of normal unarmed civilians and things. But if we send a legion or two, a few cohorts of trained regulars, certainly they wouldn't be able to stand against those. Well, Spartacus and his men were. So a second expedition is sent out because, you know, this is really quite serious. This is a real worry to the state. They can't just have a giant slave revolt happening in Italy. So they send another sort of 5,000 odd men, which gets split up between a couple of leaders, one called Varinus, another called Furius. And Spartacus decides to engage one of these straight away, the force of 2,000, and we're told that he just routs those. And he catches the other contingent while they're sort of off guard, while they're bathing near a place called Salinae. And so the Romans send another big contingent of men to try and kill or apprehend or otherwise put down Spartacus under a praetor. And Spartacus defeats them. The next one, we're told, next Spartacus defeated the praetor himself at a number of engagements and finally captured his lictors and the very horse that he rode. So Spartacus, a bit like, on a much, much smaller scale, of course, a bit like Hannibal, just keeps beating all the armies that are sent against him and keeps running around Italy being a nuisance and causing all sorts of destruction. Plutarch tells us, quote, "By this time, Spartacus had grown to be a great and formidable power, but he showed no sign of losing his head. He could not expect to prove superior to the whole power of Rome, and so he began to lead his army northwards to the Alps. His view was that they should cross the mountains and then disperse to their own homes, some to Thrace and some to Gaul. His men, however, would not listen to him. They were strong in numbers and full of confidence, and they went about Italy ravaging everything in their way. There was now more to disturb the Senate than just the shame and the disgrace of the revolt. The situation had become dangerous enough to inspire real fear, and as a result both consuls were sent out to deal with what was considered a major war and a most difficult one to fight. One of the consuls, Gellius, fell suddenly upon and entirely destroyed the German contingent of Spartacus's troops, because, by the way, Spartacus had been gaining more and more recruits to his side. Anyone that's got sort of a deadly axe to grind against Rome was joining him, like a snowball, just keeps gathering momentum. Again, a bit like Hannibal. But the German contingent of Spartacus's troops were entirely destroyed, who in their insolent self-confidence had marched off on their own and lost contact with the rest. But when Lentulus, the other consul, had surrounded him with large forces, Spartacus turned to attack, joined battle, defeated the legates of Lentulus, and captured all their equipment. He then pushed on towards the Alps and was confronted by Cassius, the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, with an army of 10,000 men. In the battle that followed, Cassius was defeated, and after losing many of his men, only just managed to escape with his own life. So Spartacus was very, very difficult to defeat. He must have been a good tactician, absolutely a great tactician. To come up against now easily half a dozen decent Roman, at least half decent Roman commanders, and beat them all. Well, at the very least you can say he's above average, but you know, taken in the round, we can say Spartacus was a superb tactician. There's nothing else you can infer. Plutarch continues, this news roused the Senate to anger. The consuls were told to return to civilian life, and Crassus was appointed to the supreme command of the war. Because of his reputation, or because of their friendship with him, large numbers of the nobility volunteered to serve with him. Spartacus was now bearing down on Picenum, and Crassus himself took up a position on the borders of the district, with the intention of meeting the attack there. He ordered one of his subordinate commanders, Mummius, with 2 legions, to march round to another route, and instructed him to follow the enemy, but not to join battle with them, or even to do any skirmishing. Mummius, however, as soon as he saw what appeared to him a good opportunity, offered battle, and was defeated. Many of his men were killed, and many saved their lives by throwing away their arms and running for it. Cassius gave Mummius himself a very rough reception after this. He rearmed his soldiers and made them give guarantees that in future they would preserve the arms in their possessions, i.e., you know, don't attack, be Fabian about it. Then he took 500 of those who had been the first to fly and had shown themselves the greatest cowards, and dividing them into 50 squads of 10 men each, put to death one man chosen by lot from each squad. This was a traditional method of punishing soldiers, now revived by Crassus, after having been out of use for many years. Those who are punished in this way not only lose their lives, but are also disgraced, since the whole army is there to watch, and the actual circumstances of the execution are very savage and repulsive. After employing this method of conversion on his men, Crassus led them against the enemy, but Spartacus slipped away from him and marched through Lucania to the sea. At the straits he fell in with some pirate ships from Cilicia, and formed the plan of landing 2,000 men in Sicily and seizing the island. He would be able, he thought, to start another revolt of the slaves there, since the previous slave war had recently died down and only needed a little fuel to make it blaze out again. Yeah, the second servile war on Sicily was not that long ago. However, the Sicilians, after agreeing to his proposals and receiving gifts from him, failed to keep their promises and sailed off. So Spartacus marched back again from the sea and established his army in the peninsula of Rhegium. At this point, Crassus came up. His observation of the place made him see what should be done, and he began to build fortifications right across the isthmus. In this way, he was able at the same time to keep his own soldiers busy and to deprive the enemy of supplies. The task which he had set himself was neither easy nor inconsiderable, but he finished it, and contrary to all expectations, had it done in a very short time. A ditch, nearly 40 miles long and 15 feet wide and deep, was carried across the neck of land from sea to sea, and above the ditch he constructed a wall which was astonishingly high and strong. At first Spartacus despised these fortifications and did not take them seriously, but soon he found himself short of plunder, and when he wanted to break out from the peninsula, he realised that he was walled up and could get no more supplies where he was. So he waited for a night when it was snowing and a wintry storm had got up, and then, after filling up a small section of the ditch with earth and timber and branches of trees, managed to get a third of his army across." End quote. So Spartacus sort of just about gets away from there, and we're told that Crassus and all the other sort of loyal Romans, so to speak, were sort of highly alarmed that, you know, the wolf is on the loose again. They're worried that Spartacus, not only did he get out of that trap, but he also got beyond Crassus's army as well. And there was sort of nothing standing between him and Rome. It's still a long way from Rhegium to Rome, but there was no army standing between him, and for a while there, for a small window of time, everyone's worried that Spartacus might actually, you know, march on Rome. You know, if Hannibal couldn't take Rome, or felt he couldn't, Spartacus isn't really going to be able to, realistically. And so during that period of time, when Crassus is worried, everyone's worried, he sends letters to some of the other great generals of the day, Lucullus and Pompey. He sends them letters saying, "Come back to Rome, quick. We all sort of need your help. Spartacus has escaped again, and you know, we need to sort of kind of pull out all the stops to make sure that we sort of crush him out completely and defeat him utterly once and for all here. Just need a little bit of help." But very quickly, we get the impression, although Plutarch never tells us explicitly, but within days, or certainly within weeks, it becomes clear that Spartacus's power, or his might, should we say, has been kind of broken, and that really Crassus can deal with it all by himself. And so he decides he needs to do that as quickly as possible. If Crassus wants to gain all the credit for winning the Spartacan War, the Third Servile War, he needs to do it before someone like Lucullus or Pompey turns up, because then he would have to share the credit with them. And so he does, he forces the issue. Crassus sort of forces Spartacus into a pitched battle and basically wins it. We're told that Crassus's troops are able to kill something in the order of 12,300 of Spartacus's men. And although Spartacus himself isn't killed or apprehended, that does kind of really break the back of his power. But yeah, he's still at large, he's still out there, he's still got a few thousand men with him. And so although Crassus has done all the hard work, he's basically won the war, he hasn't absolutely won it. And then Pompey turns up on the scene. Spartacus is sort of fully on the run to the mountains, and he's able to turn at one point and rout the Roman vanguard that's pursuing him, which is only a small-scale thing. Broadly speaking, he's already defeated. Strategically, he's basically already defeated. But he wins another little engagement there. And Plutarch says, quote, "This success turned out to be the undoing of Spartacus, since it filled his slaves, the last of his slave army, with overconfidence. They refused any longer to avoid battle and would not even obey their officers," end quote. So Spartacus has sort of lost control of his men, or tight control anyway. And Pompey's now on his way, so Spartacus's cause is, you know, absolutely defeated. He's got no way to win. And here's the paragraph in Plutarch telling of Spartacus's death. Quote, "First, when his horse was brought to him, he drew his sword and killed it," that Spartacus did, saying that the enemy had plenty of good horses which would be his if he won, and if he lost, he would not need a horse at all. Then he made straight for Crassus himself. This is during the final engagement, the last stand, the last Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid style stand. Then he made straight for Crassus himself, charging forward through the press of weapons and wounded men, and though he did not reach Crassus, he cut down 2 centurions who fell on him together. Finally, when his own men had taken to flight, he himself, surrounded by enemies, still stood his ground and died fighting to the last.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.